on this particular webinar. So in terms of what the points are, this is what I'm going to aim to cover. So if we wanted to look at a definition of culture, it's actually quite a tricky one to define, because there are many ways in which it is defined. It's a nebulous concept, but fundamentally I see it as the way in which we operate as groups. So whether that's within the organisation that we work for, we might have a culture within our own family, with our own countries. We're often unaware of it, and it's incredibly powerful. And I'm just having a look at why you're here. So some of you are doing projects, it's very relevant looking at these things into how it might affect your culture. So just lots of sort of general knowledge. It's one of those interesting subjects, isn't it? That's tricky. This particular quote, I'm sure loads of you have seen before, where they say culture eats strategy for breakfast. And many of us who are in L&D or OD roles might be drawn to that, because that's a tricky thing. We're brought in to develop or deliver a cultural strategy, sorry. We're brought in to deliver a strategy, but the reality is the culture can pull it back. And it's one of the other reasons that change is so difficult, because often aspects of the culture can pull in the opposite direction. The flip side of it, why we should focus on culture, it's one of the keys to organisational success. This is Edgar Schein, who's a major guru on culture. And the function of leadership is the creation and management of culture. And as we go through this, I think I'll keep coming back to this point of leadership, which is definitely something which is of relevance. So my questions to you in terms of this, finding out what you think already, how do you recognise the culture of an organisation? If you think of the culture within your own, I'll ask you later what you think it is, but what is it you see that makes you go, oh, they've got this kind of culture, or they're that kind of culture? And are there any really powerful drivers of culture in your opinion? Alice is saying, first time looking at how you maintain your culture when we're not going to the office anymore. And Liz agrees with that. So I suppose the question for me is, what does that say about the culture for you then? Why would the culture stop if you're not together? What is it that you're feeling is culture? Symbols and language, says Dave. So the words you use, what would be an example of a symbol, Dave? Inspirational leadership team. So when they're inspirational, are they talking about the future? Are they empathic? What sort of things are you seeing? Values, behaviours, language, says Travis. The people, the mission, a culture of creativity, crazy artwork, bright pink. Oh, okay, so you're not going to see that anymore. How can you take that into the home environment, I wonder? So you've got on those creative, okay, that answers a little bit of what I might see. I'll let you guys can see your own actual tips here in terms of what's in there. Thank you for the fantastic examples that you're putting here, because actually some of you, I can tell what your cultural style will be when we look at the Cameron and Quinn model later. So hierarchy is another one. People want to fit in. That's an interesting one. People want to fit into the culture. So does that feel that not everybody, is it a slightly exclusive culture? There are ins and outs, rules, how decisions are made. Absolutely. All those brilliant examples. The examples are getting better and better and better, actually. I'd like to grab these if we can for afterwards. Helen, I don't know if we can grab these out. We can't always keep the chat. So those are the sort of things that we see. So absolutely, there are loads and loads of things, whether it's symbols, whether it's a leadership, whether it's our vision. There are loads of things which link to culture. And it's not one thing. And it's really, how do we recognise that? And what are the most powerful drivers? Decision making, I agree, Jenny, is a major one that I come across when I'm working with customers, potential customers. Their decision making, how long it takes to get a contract signed, is a great example of a culture I'll use later. So if I go further on here, this model here, I'm going to look at 3 models during this. This initial one is a really simple model, and as I said, Edgar Schein is the guru of culture. He's written a lot on culture, and this is a very simple one called the onion model with a slight adaptation. So his onion model is, he actually divided it initially into 3 different levels. So on the outside, you've got your artifacts and symbols, which is, these are things that some of you are talking about, and actually to a certain extent, Alice, the outside of your, if I remember your name right, I'm quite impressed with that, you know, the colourful walls, those are symbolic aspects of culture. So those things that show to other people what they are, but for that really to be a creative culture, there would be values behind that which allow people to be creative, maybe allow people to make mistakes. So it'd be espoused values. And then Shine talked about these basic underlying assumptions as well that sat in place. Now, as you can see, I've put leadership and influencers. I added this in because he then goes on to talk hugely about the impact of leaders and influencers in gluing these together, of almost translating these underlying assumptions and espoused values. And it is my belief that actually the way the leadership work in an organization, and it doesn't have to be just leaders, it doesn't have to be positional power leaders, but clearly in a hierarchical organization, positional power makes a difference. It may also be just those people who have the influence, who have the informal power within the organization. It does depend. So thinking about symbols and artifacts, you might think about where we've heard of Silicon Valley firms with beanbags and pool tables. That's synonymous with a young, innovative culture. But if you decide that you want to do a culture change and we go, actually, we're going to be the next Google, and all we need to do is put table tennis tables in the hallway and paint the walls orange, that doesn't necessarily do it, because that is just the surface level. So it's fine if that is an outside depiction of your culture, then it's legitimate. But actually, if we wanted to change it, as is always the case with things like onion models, it's understanding what's right at the center and what's within. So simply changing logos or brands, and you do occasionally see organizations do this, that they rebrand. It doesn't necessarily make a great difference unless it's just for the marketplace. It doesn't necessarily change how they do business. So if we're a very traditional, slow to operate business and we decide to change our brand with a snazzy logo, that isn't going to make the difference that we may be after. So we need to be able to dig beneath the surface and think about what it is about the values that we're espousing. And by espoused values, like the stated values, and this is the key. So we might say that we have respect for people, but if the leaders and the influencers don't walk that talk, then that also undermines those espoused values. So we really want to make sure that all of these aspects of our organization are aligned. I mean, I remember going back 20 odd years when values were relatively new in mission statements back in a pharmaceutical company I worked for, and that respect for people was one of the values, and that was the one that people jumped on all the time if they didn't feel that leaders were living up to it. So it's quite important to make sure that we do get these things actually being verbalized, but most importantly, the way in which people behave in that organization are absolutely walking that talk and modeling them. So I think you can probably see that the style of this in terms of how this works, and I will come back and read all of your comments, but I just can't read them all and keep on talking, so I will come back through those. So the key right at the bottom of this model, though, is the basic underlying assumptions, and this is where Shine said you might not even be aware of it. So it might be our underlying behaviours or beliefs. Now, interestingly, of course, this is where they talk about things like unconscious bias in the areas of diversity, that if there's things underneath it, our behaviours will demonstrate them. And maybe we even have to be prepared to challenge those basic underlying assumptions. And you could have a simple example, though. If you imagine that you're someone who's joining a new startup and you're really excited going to this company and they've said they're going to give you full training, and your background is a corporate organization, and when you joined you went through a 6-week induction course, and you arrive on the first day at this fresh startup ready for your full training, and you realize that they are ready to support you in learning, but you have to be self-sufficient. It's a completely different paradigm around induction and learning. Neither of them are necessarily right or wrong, but you can see how somebody might find that they feel like a fish out of water if they've entered a new culture and maybe their preference is for a different one. So that's the first model, which is kind of a simple model to look at in terms of Edgar Schein's onion model. But then if we want to think about, well, what type of culture we are, the model that I quite like is called the Competing Values Framework. And this is well known by Cameron and Quinn. And I'm not saying that every single one of us will fit 100% into one of these boxes, because like personalities, we don't necessarily fit 100% into boxes. But this model here talks about 4 cultures, and it's largely to do with where the control sits, or the power, and what the priorities are, whether they're internally or externally focused. So on the left hand side, it would be more internally focused, and you'd look here and you say the top would be clan culture, and as it suggests, really, the name's about doing things together. Their model might be collaborate. It's quite often an example of maybe a founder-led business or a family business. And this can be really positive because it is about collaborating, working together, can have a family feel. But the downside of this is as they start to grow and bring in other people that perhaps aren't part of the original group, maybe if it really is a family firm, people who are external to the family, then you can find a level of bickering, infighting, and it almost can, behavioural style can disproportionately affect things. I believe that a clan culture doesn't necessarily work if you get beyond about 50 people, because you need to start putting in levels of hierarchy and process, and so it can become quite difficult. So that would be quite common in a startup, family business or something. And usually really you need to be able to move it on. If you end up and you're in a clan culture, you think that's the organization you're in, perhaps that's not necessarily realistic. It's not working appropriately. The key there really is to, because what can happen is you can see that all of the decisions are made at the top. People will complain about the fact that you're not on the in crowd. If you're not part of the clan, then you don't necessarily get communicated with, and you don't necessarily know what's going on, and people feel suspicious about where the power sits. So if you are in that situation and it is your job to try and develop the culture, then you need to have that leader, the founder, to be prepared to have a mirror held up to them. You need to be prepared to show them the impact of if they are not supporting a new way of working. They might say, yes, we need to be more market oriented, yet their behaviours are undermining that unintentionally. So you need to be brave and be prepared to hold a mirror up to them, to help them realise that new roles or ways of working won't work if they carry on unintentionally acting in the old way. Sometimes you might find the best option for this clan leader is to move on, and you do sometimes see that as well, that as these businesses grow, that original founder has to move on. The second model is more externally focused, and that's more of a creative model. So that would be an adhocracy culture, so it's about doing new things. And that's a great way to, that's usually quite young and vibrant, you might see. Oh, sorry, I've moved my slide on. Now it's decided it's very responsive, my mouse here. So if we were to look at this particular adhocracy culture, it's different in terms of the fact that they're externally focused, but also keen to win new business, but they do it through innovation and creativity. I think about disruptors in the marketplace that are shaking up the traditional marketplace through innovation. So they might be winning business from more traditional hierarchical cultures, or they might be creating totally new markets. What they're quite good at is speed to market and creativity. And in order to be good at that, if this is where your organisation wanted to go, let's say, they do need to take on a much more empowering management style, because you can't operate quickly if everyone has to wait to be told what to do. So if we say those left-hand two are much more internally focused, if you want to be more creative, then there has to be a greater empowerment and dissemination of power, essentially. Move it away from those who are the most senior. Now, of course, every culture, none of them is perfect. Because this culture can potentially be so individualistic, the challenge is taking people with you during change. They may well be, think about tech firms, actually they just love creating, they just do it for the love of it. It's not necessarily bought into the overall market strategy or the overall goals. And the other risk with this culture is if you looked at something like Cotter, which is a completely different webinar, but embedding change, is I think because they're quite into new shiny things, they can be quite poor at follow through. So you need to have someone who's a really great implementer to make sure things are embedded in order to make sure those really creative, exciting new things that you've done well you want to repeat are repeatable, and we don't just go off down the garden path doing the next new thing. So that's your adhocracy culture. Hopefully some of you are recognizing them now. I know I've heard one that I thought would come up as that. Hierarchical culture, we've all heard of this one. So these are more formal, structured, they've got embedded processes and procedures. There tends to be relatively little room for flexibility. They might talk about empowerment, but it's often quite difficult to genuinely feel empowered because there's so many processes that you have to work within. So they've got values around doing things right, following the rules, and it's all about stability and control. So the downside of this is, a disruptor might come in and just move ahead of these people. But generally though, although they're risk averse and can be very slow to change, they can be just incredibly streamlined. I mean, so I used to work for Siemens, and that was a high control culture, but they did have levels of innovation in there. So they'd put things like lean thinking in, and they had that ability to drive things through. You also see hierarchical cultures in public sector, and the NHS, charities, lots of those sort of things. And what's interesting about those kind of hierarchical cultures is that I wonder whether or not people come in and almost, maybe because they've stayed there a long time, they don't necessarily have the confidence to challenge it. So although that culture might really want to be empowering and fresh and free thinking, it's a big Titanic. So it takes quite a lot to actually move it, and it takes people with quite a lot of resilience, and you have to get everybody aligned on board. To achieve culture change in these organizations, you need to go by the book, literally roll out the Kotter model. And I'll say I've got a webinar on that and a podcast on that if you don't know what I'm talking about there. But just go step by step and give it a decent amount of time. And then finally, market culture. So these are the ones that would say they're customer focused. And they'd say they're customer focused, but the reality is it's about winning. It is about delivering for the stakeholders. It would be about moving quickly. And the downside, I suppose, of a market culture can be it's so competitive that the employees can sometimes feel like an afterthought, where we might not have the money to spend on development because it would take away from the profit margins. So although they want to be innovative and break into new markets and win, it's almost profitability is the biggest driver. Customer retention and satisfaction that everyone would be aware of, and those would be top drivers for this sort of organization. I would expect them to have a good a scorecard and good matrices or matrices that they gather and record information against. Now, if you want to make change in this kind of culture, then the way to get it through is you've got to strongly align it with the company strategy. You need to get on board with sales and marketing, and you need to get on board with the finance team, because it needs to work in pounds, shilling and pence. It's not going to be the driver of doing the best thing for our people isn't going to be sufficient to motivate a potentially painful change. So having key target metrics for success is going to be important in this area that you can refer back to and follow up. So those are 4 types of culture that I've explained in a decent amount of detail there. Which of those, if you had to choose one, and as I said earlier, I realised that, well, actually one isn't perfect, there's always downsides of any of them. Which of those would you go for? And Helen, I'm just wondering if you can put the first poll up for me, because I've got too much to see on my screen at the moment with comments and things as well. Thank you. So which would you go for? Let's see what our proportions are. Keep going, got 10 more seconds, just choose one. Right, okay, so I'll just count down from 5 and then we'll declare it. We've got 75% have voted, so choose one quickly now if you want to, and then we'll end the polling and you can share it. So we can see here that 44% of people on this call, what I don't know is whether or not this is a representative demographic of the UK. So 44% feel they're mainly in a hierarchical culture. So maybe if you haven't heard the Kotter webinar, or you might want to. 16% are in a compete market culture. 15% are in the adhocracy. and 25%, costs more than I would have thought, are actually in a clan or collaboration one. Just out of curiosity, before I go on to the next slide, if you are in the clan culture, in fact, if you feel happy to do it, just put what you chose, clan, and say, if you're in clan culture, I'm curious, are you in a business under 50 people or more? Or are you in a larger business? So was that assumption that I made earlier accurate or inaccurate? I'll just stop sharing the results now and go back to slides. And those of you in the other ones as well. So if you're in a hierarchical culture, are you in a public sector or a private sector organisation? Curiosity. And autocracy, are you in the creative arts? Just curious as to what you'd write in there to see what you think. So Jenny, I recognise your name, Jenny. We must have met back in the NHS, and I'm assuming you went for hierarchy, Jenny, I am assuming. Okay, so Marion, you've got more than 50 and you're in a clan culture. Does it work? I'd be interested to know what works about that then. So they must have put some structure and processes in. Clan 4,000. Oh, this looks like my assumptions are entirely wrong here in terms of the clan. So if my question to you that you may not be able to answer in the chat, I'd love to know further, is that if you are in a clan culture and it works and you're in a larger organization, would you say you've got some hierarchy in place, or what is it that makes it work in there? Because I can't imagine that all of the conversations are made completely sensitive in the center, or is it just you've got really good values about being collaborative? A hierarchical large private, which was what I worked for, but they had pockets of innovation. A clan innovation consultancy. The lady earlier who was a games company, great, yeah, autocracy. So that's you're lovely. Then you're the one, Alice, that's not sure how you're going to keep your culture going. Okay, in terms of that. That's fascinating, actually, in terms of this. I'm sure I'll let you guys read down how different everybody is on here. And actually, I'll just mention this to people on this. We have got a LinkedIn group called the HR Uprising, which you can find on LinkedIn if you go onto it. And actually, we've started doing more networking, and quite a lot of people who've joined these webinars have started talking to each other and sharing. So you might see someone on here has got a similar organisation to you or a very different one, and could be a great connection. So do make a note of that. We can't send out names, but if you see someone who you think, oh, actually they'd be good to link in, or an easy way of doing it is when you leave this webinar, sign up to the HR Uprising webinar. LinkedIn group, and then you'll be able to find people and talk to people through that. Okay, on to my third model. So this is what I call the cultural web. Well, I don't call it the cultural web. It is known as the cultural web. And this talks about 7 aspects to culture that you can recognize. In terms of going through each one of them term, it starts at the top in terms of the organizational paradigm. So again, that would be very much like those underlying assumptions that Shine said. All of these are really saying similar things, but in slightly different ways. And the reason I've chosen this one to end on is that this is quite a useful one for if you're trying to plan an as is to be structure. It goes into a little bit more granular detail, and I've got an example on that on the next slide. So if we think about organizational structures, that's the hierarchy, or the way in which, the extent to which there is a hierarchy. People talk about a flat structure or a hierarchical structure, and that illustrates where the power lies in theory. So it's where the positional power lies. Depending on the type of organization is, of course, whether that's where the decisions are made or whether they're made in slightly different pockets. You've then got things like control systems. So systems and mechanisms that report on and control the organization. Now, those are quite interesting ones. A good example of that I remember experiencing when I was in corporate life was where they were trying to be more, the organization was talking about being empowering, but they had a sign-off. So the D of A, delegation of authority process, didn't go down the organization very far. So in order to get anything really minor signed off, and I remember they did a no expenses system and made it even worse, effectively disempowered people. So say go out and be creative, or buy stuff that you need for your home office, but you had to go and get a 50p rubber signed off by the director of the apartment. Clearly I'm exaggerating, but again, if your control systems are not in line with the aspirations as a paradigm, we want to be empowering and creative, you have to make sure these things all line up. The same with the structure. If you're incredibly hierarchical and you want to be devolved and close to the customer, then sometimes that doesn't work. So control systems, power structures. So a little bit like the organizational structure, but these are the people who have both formal and positional power. Do you have to go to certain people to get things done? Do you have to go and talk to Fred in IT to be able to get things done, as opposed to have to or someone in marketing to be able to get your slides signed off? Where does the actual informal and positional power? If you want to change something, do you have to go around a number of people in different corners of the organization to get them on side before you can try and make a change? So understanding where the power lies in your system, in the organization, is key. Symbols, well, we've talked about symbols earlier, so it's the same, they mean exactly the same here in terms of symbols. So official and unofficial representations of culture. Now, we talked about official, so things like officers and beanbags and things, but you also see things which are less official. We used to have a non-official uniform in sales and marketing, where the sales director at the time was insistent on people wearing a white shirt. Well, men particularly, and so everyone was suited and booted. It'd be quite old-fashioned now, but that was the day he was sort of he wanted to dress like a financial services guy. And you see these different cultures. If you go around the city of London, there are people in gear that look entirely different from people on Silicon Roundabout. So those are all sort of unofficial dress codes, which also say things about our culture. And then you've got things like stories and myths, where there are past events and stories about the people in an organisation that carry on being passed down from one to another. And again, I am sharing from my the German FD of the company that I work for. I've already mentioned it was a branch of Siemens, which is no longer, so it doesn't really matter. And he once stood, and he was quoted, and I don't know if this is ever true, but he was quoted as saying, as he looked out of the window, "There lies our greatest asset." Now, and as you know, we most usually say that your greatest asset is people. And what he was actually talking about was the company car stock, which says it all, doesn't it, really? So that was a bit legendary in terms of how people felt they were viewed within the organisation at that time. There were various leaders that made us feel much better as well. Oh, Mark said someone had to experience of having to return an empty biro before they could get a new one. Wow. These things actually, those little adages, in a serious note, we haven't got time to go into it here, but when we're moving to a virtual working environment, what is absolutely critical is trust. And those sort of activities, a service approval for a first-class stamp. Brilliant examples here, fantastic. So absolutely, if you've got silly examples like that people quote, that is the opposite of trust. So we need to get great examples where people are able to feel empowered to do something really positive. And if anyone's got one of those, just take that in as well. It's always easier to remember the bad ones. Well, Rob sounds like he experienced the Biro problem as well. Classic. Okay, these are great. So this is an example that I've done of an as is and to be. It is just an example, and actually you recognise that I have obviously drawn on my own experience to a certain extent in terms of what they were doing. So in this particular organisation, you've got an organisation, it's German, it's process driven, it's all about high quality, it's research led, things are secure, they're financially stable, they're trustworthy, but they're definitely not fast moving. It was a hierarchical role structure reporting into a parent company, and actually there are a few of you who've got different parent companies. That can depend. So this was very interesting actually. This organisation I worked for, the bit of Siemens it was a telecoms bit. They actually, the best time working for it was when the parent company decided to sell us, and actually we were independent. So then it was quite an entrepreneurial environment, and the culture was empowered because we no longer had to operate as a massive global international giant. So it freed up that parent companies. The parent company reporting can create some pain. And you often hear that also in other hierarchical organizations where you've got to put everything through the board of directors or the execs, even the non-execs. Control systems, annual cycles of budgeting. These are all the things that you'd recognize. So this is, I'm pretty much explaining as you read down that, a hierarchical organization. And there is the example. People would gossip about the executive board. There was very much a them and us. The board meetings always overrun, all those sort of things. They always talk finance first and the people stuff always gets knocked off the agenda. Those are the sort of things which were the stories and myths based on some truth. Now, they wanted to be seen as innovative, responsive, customer focused. So what they needed to do is build greater matrix or team-based structures which were focused around the market requirements. In order to do that, it was too slow meeting the customer needs. So they're basically saying they wanted to be more of a market culture, or a bit more of that right-hand side of the Cameron Quinn model. In order to do that, need to have greater disseminated decision making and financial controls, business case driven resourcing, so empowering people to make the case for how things are done, as opposed to top down. There would be an element of upward business cases as well. Empowerment and accountability. So you can see actually this is what is needed much more, and actually if we're going to carry on working remotely, these sorts of areas I would suggest are what we need to develop in terms of the power structures. Symbols, hot desks, well I think now we'd say virtual working, online collaboration, technology that allows you to collaborate. And you can read the rest yourself. So those would be more examples of how you might change. So I shared that with you because if you were involved in a culture change, it would be quite interesting, this exercise, to do with a group of people. So what is our is and what is our to be? And then it will help you become more granular about it. And the reason I say that is because, again, it's very easy if we want to make a change to go, let's just focus on the symbols, or let's just focus on the values, the organizational mission, and we'll change that and the rest will follow. But the reality is it really won't. Going back to the onion model, if things are not aligned, in particular the leadership, then it's going to get undermined, and and that's why we have so many people say that change doesn't work. So if we can put up one more poll, and there isn't really a right or wrong answer to this, but I wondered, where would you say, I said where would you start to develop the culture, but I thought, which one do you think makes the biggest difference in either undermining culture change or making it succeed? And by all means, if you feel able to, put why you've chosen that one in the chat. Keep going, guys. Okay, still going up, 50%. I'll give you 5 more seconds because I'm conscious that of the time. Just keep moving. I've only got 1 or 2 more slides after this. Okay, so we've gone for power structures. So actually where the power lies. And actually, I've got to say, I think I really do agree with you in terms of undermining. Certainly, I think that that can be a very, 33% have gone power structures. I can't see the chat yet, see what you've said. Certainly, if you don't know where the power lies, people say yes on face value and nothing happens. Or even worse, you put loads of energy into putting together the business case, you told it's what everyone wants, and then somebody somewhere else goes, but actually we can't do that because of that. It's not just power, isn't it? It's about where the knowledge lies as well. So you can sometimes find that, oh, we can't do that because actually we're about to amalgamate, or there's something else going on in the background that undermines it. So yes, I think that's a very powerful one. I don't think there's right or wrong answer here. I think control systems and structures can probably, maybe is to do with communication and people's ability to collaborate and communicate. So that can cause silos and maybe again blocks in power. Control systems, I think, is quite an interesting one because that actually is that classic thing where things like the sign off, things can undermine it. And if you do go and look at Costa as a model, what he talks about when you're embedding change is, I would say you need to have things like the power structures on side at the start and the vision, which is a paradigm at the start of change, but towards the end of change, to truly embed it, that's where you've got to make sure that things like the control systems and the structures and the symbols and all those things are lined up. So for example, if you had a merger, even though none of us have chosen symbols, if you had a merger and then you've still got the company note paper with the old brand 2 years ago, then it undermines it. So ideally, if we're making change, we need to make all of these line up as much as possible, which is why it's quite a good map, because it helps you avoid having blockers. Thank you for sharing that, and I'll stop sharing the results now. Oops. Will I stop sharing results? Can you stop sharing results? I just, hang on, I think I just ought to get rid of it, Helen.
I think I have.
Yeah, you've got it. Thank you. Grapevine. Oh, that's true. Yes, I would 100% agree that the grapevine is also important. All are important, but leadership powers that bring the culture. Well, 100%. Yeah. So it's leadership. Does all come down to leadership. All right. And on that, that's quite a good point to move on to the final content slide. So Edgar Schein talks about, so if you're wanting to get your leadership to embed change, he talks about primary and secondary embedding mechanisms. And these are basically the things that the leaders pay attention to, they measure and control. You know, the adage that basically if people measure what matters. And so if you get people to measure it, then people will think it matters. So this might be it may be what leaders notice and comment on. So what do they recognize? These sort of things that embedding activities. It's where they're prepared to spend money, how they allocate resource, what they see as important. Really key is casual comments or questions can send such clear signals. I once was on a training course where the CEO said, and they were rolling out a new system, and the CEO said, well, this is never going to work, is it? And frankly, I was like, they might as well have stopped right there. So throwaway comments can make a massive difference to success of things. So all of those sort of things, they make a huge difference, and they speak louder than words, actions. So role modeling, how people recruit, select, they call it excommunicate, which I guess is allow levers. So whether they send people off positively or negatively. The other things are further embedding mechanisms. And the reason they say they're secondary, or why Edgar Schein says they're secondary, is because actually these things on the left, they can't happen unless you've got these things on the left in place. So the stories and those physical aspects, and those serve to reinforce and embed things more so. So good things to just be aware of there. Okay, so those were the key aspects I wanted to share with you. If anyone has got any questions, the desire to remove flexible working goal, the mind boggles, doesn't it? If you have got any questions or comments actually that people want to get going as a conversation on here or take it elsewhere, challenges you've got, outstanding questions, I'm happy to take questions for people. We'd be really grateful. I've just posted a survey. This is on a different topic, but we're putting a lot of webinars out at the moment and a lot of podcasts, and it's always helpful if we've got data to understand and to actually validate what we're talking, which is why even the polls on here are really helpful and insightful, because an assumption I had earlier is probably not correct now with regard to clan culture. But we've got a talent management survey. We've just posted in here. It's on the email, so you don't have to do it now, but if anyone has, it will take about 5 minutes. Be very, very grateful if you're able to grab that link and fill it out for us, because we just need a few more respondents to make sure it's valid information and the results are going to be of use. Other links, and all of these will come out to you anyway. I'm running another webinar on Thursday, which is more about well-being. So this could be aimed at managers. What we're going to do going forward, so I'm going to be running 2 webinars a month on different themes, and we will do them, one of which is aimed at HR or for anybody, and the other one can be aimed at line managers. So if you are, I know lots of you are in HR, so hopefully it's relevant for you, but it's also something that you can invite a manager to, or you can share the recording with them, because we'll send out the recording to you and we host them all on our website. So if you want to see what's coming up, topic in August is all about performance, increasing performance, dealing with underperformance, and then learning, developing a learning culture in September. And this way you can access these previous resources. Now I've got one final poll for you to get some feedback for you, please, on how useful you found this poll. So just be really grateful for that. So this is anonymous data, so it's just really helpful if you can let us know when we're hitting the mark or not. In terms of this. Our poor Fernando has just entered the meeting room. He's not going to get very much value out of it. And if you found something where, it's always interesting to see the range of responses here. If there's something that didn't work for you, feel free to give us more feedback on that. If there's something that we can do differently. So then I'd be really grateful to know what that is, particularly if you've gone 4 or 5. So there's a couple of you who've gone, one of you who's gone 4 and one's gone 5. So I'd be really grateful to know that. I can see most of you saying it's extremely useful or otherwise. because I can't learn from it. And there's lots of people on here, so I want to get it right for you when we've got lots of people on here to add value for you. Okay, so we'll just give you a couple more minutes to do that. I'll gather a few more in, and I will just move on to the final slide. Right, these just final slides. These are just links to let you know about Change Superhero Toolkit. The link to that is here. It's linked to the book that I've written. You can get the Audible, which talks about culture on there, and that is, if you have an Audible, it only came out on Audible this week, which is why I'm plugging it. So there's all the links there. And if you want to download a cultural web template and other aspects of culture that you might find useful, there's a Change Superhero Toolkit that you can get from our website, and there's about 15 different resources on change that you can use. And I will go back and read these properly. I'll just end here. Do link in with me, join the LinkedIn group. Thank you so much for joining us. Sorry, it goes on a little bit longer, but I hope the content was valid to you. I was trying to explain it as well as possible because it is quite an interesting content. And I will read down these. Please feel free, if anyone's got any further questions, to put them here. I'll stay on and happy to open up the line, answer questions. Usually I don't get those. Elizabeth, thank you. I'm amazed that I've got energy. I woke up at 3:30 this morning, so I must be on my final final legs of it. Practical steps to move from one culture to the next. Yeah, I'll think about that. What next? I think it's about what I would say so far. It's about looking at the embedding mechanisms. So it's getting the leadership on board, and starting to look at how you can embed those. Thank you, Austin. Thanks, Charlene. I'm just reading through your comments. Oh, comments have gone. Hang on, the results are gone. Thank you, Karen. Jenny, where do I know you from? I know your name. All right, let's add towards the end. Yeah, to be, that's it. And it's just using the right to be. That was just a to be on that example. It's got to be the right to be for your vision, for your organization, in terms of the cultural web. I'll try, Rob. Thank you. Yes, it is great. Thanks for being so. Thank you, everybody. From I know your name from the webinars, do I? I was thinking I must know you from the NHS. In terms of this, absolutely. Thank you very much to everyone for participating. The participation has gone up as we've been running these webinars, and it makes all the difference. The only downside is that I can't keep up with things as we go through it, but it's great to read back, and really useful. Okay, practical steps roadmap. I will think about how I can do that. It's quite hard. It is really quite hard culture. So I will think further. Okay, right. I will stop waffling on to you all. Thank you so much for joining. I'm really glad you joined it. All of the previous webinar recordings are accessible from the website, and we will close it down. Thanks, Rob. We will close down the meeting for everybody.